everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. Firstly, I just want to apologise that there wasn't a new video last week. I'm not sure if you'll be able to tell from my voice, but I have recently been ill. Not COVID, thankfully. I think it was just a cold, but I did have a very sore throat and I lost my voice for a while, so obviously I wasn't able to film. Hopefully my voice sounds okay now. I still feel like it sounds a little bit deep. If it does, I'm sorry, but I've had this case researched and ready to go for over a week and I've been desperate to sit down and record. I've got my hot honey and lemon, so hopefully this will help get me through the video. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about a serial killer case. Well, suspected serial killer, I suppose I should say, because this person was only ever convicted of one murder, but it is strongly believed that he was responsible for at least 2 more. And as you can tell from the title, this murderer became known as the eyeball killer because, you guessed it, he had an obsession with eyes, which played a big part in his murders. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a massive thank you to Audible for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. For those of you who have never heard of Audible before, they are the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks, and I have been using their service for so long now because I just love how they have such a wide range of things to listen to on there, from bestsellers to new releases, celebrity memoirs, and so much more. When you become a member of Audible, you are given 1 credit every single month, which you can use to purchase any title in the entire premium selection, regardless of the price. And those titles are yours to keep forever in your Audible library. And you can download titles and listen offline anytime. So it's great for when you're on the go and you want something to listen to. For example, I use Audible a lot when I am out walking my dogs. I just put my headphones in and pop on an audiobook and I love it. Audible members are also given access to the Popular Plus catalogue, where as well as audiobooks you can listen to thousands of podcasts, guided fitness and meditation programs, and sleep tracks for better rest, which is one of my personal favourites. As I've said before, I also use Audible a lot whilst I am researching because there are so many good true crime books out there that are packed full of information. And one audiobook that I've just started listening to is called A Fine Day for a Hanging by Carol Ann Lee, who is an incredible true crime author, by the way. But yeah, this book is about the Ruth Ellis case. She was the last woman to be hanged in the UK after she murdered her lover. The Ruth Ellis case has been requested to me so many times, so I am hoping to cover it at some point, hopefully soon. As well as that, I have also been enjoying listening to this book, One of Us is Lying by Karen McManus. I've actually read this book before. I read it like over a year ago now and it was incredible, so I really wanted to experience it again. One of Us is Lying is a young adult murder mystery novel that is set in a high school. 5 students go into detention and only 4 leave alive. And let me tell you, the twist at the end of this book is just insane. I really did not see it coming, and I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to give it away, but I highly recommend. So if you would like to give Audible a go yourself, then you can visit audible.com/Molly, or you can text Molly to 500 500 to start your free 30-day trial. Once again, a huge thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thank you to you guys for supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for today's case, we are going back to the early 90s in Dallas, which is a city in the state of Texas in the US. Now, I don't quite know what Dallas is like today, but back when this case took place, Dallas was known for being quite crime heavy, if that's the right word. Crime rates were very high. There was a lot of violence. Homicide rates were soaring. In fact, in 1991 alone, the city of Texas had over 500 murders occur in just that 1 year. You know how usually when we talk about these cases and we talk about how they normally happen in areas where crime rates were really low and murders just didn't happen? Well, Dallas in the 90s was like the complete opposite of that. It was not a massive shock when the police received a report about a murder because it was not the safest place. However, in late 1990, another murder would occur in the city, a murder that would be the beginning of a serial killer in Dallas that would stalk the streets at night looking for their victims. In the early hours of the morning on the 13th of December 1990, Dallas police were contacted and informed that a dead body had been found on a residential street in the neighborhood of Oak Cliff in Texas. So the police went straight to the street, and there they came across a very, very horrific scene. This dead body was that of a young woman. She was partially nude when she was discovered. She was only wearing a t-shirt and a bra. She had bruises all over her chest where she had been beaten, and she had also been shot in the head with a gun. So this was very clearly a murder. There was no sign of any weapon at the scene, and her body had very clearly been posed. The killer had obviously taken time with how they arranged the position of the body so that it would shock and horrify the person that found it, and also just humiliate and degrade the victim. As I said, this woman was found partially nude, but her t-shirt had been pulled up so that her private parts and her breasts were exposed, and her arms had also been like stretched out above her head. And it didn't take very long for her to be identified. I believe one of the police officers at the scene actually knew her and recognized her, and they said that this victim was a woman named Mary Pratt. Mary Pratt was 33 years old. She was a mother, and growing up she lived just outside of Dallas with her family. And speaking of her family, she absolutely adored them. Her family meant everything to her, and Mary was a very, very loving and kind person. At the time of this case taking place, Mary was working as a sex worker in the red light district area of Oak Cliff in Dallas, which is obviously where a lot of sex workers operated and met with clients. And the night before Mary was found, that is exactly what she had been doing. She was out on the streets working, but then in the early hours of the next morning, her dead body was found just dumped on the side of a road. So it seemed like this was probably connected to her work. Her killer was likely a man that picked her up for sex the previous evening. And again, as we talked about at the start of the video, this wasn't totally out of the ordinary for a place like Dallas. There were a lot of sex workers out most nights, and it wasn't unusual for one of them to be beaten and killed by a client, which is just awful. But it was when Mary's body was taken for an autopsy that the police realised that this particular murder was unlike any other that they had ever dealt with before. So it was determined in Mary's autopsy that her cause of death was one single gunshot wound to the head, and this was near her ear towards the back of her head. She had been shot with a .44 caliber gun at close range. So the killer didn't shoot at Mary from a distance. They were very close to her when they fired that bullet, and she would have died instantly. So the medical examiner was just conducting the routine autopsy. She was noting down everything she could tell about the victim, such as, you know, hair color, height, weight, scars that she may have, whether she had any piercings or tattoos. And then the examiner got round to the eyes. She needed to write down the victim's eye color. However, when she opened one of the eyelids, there was nothing in there. Mary's eyeball wasn't in the socket, which was a bit of a shock to the examiner. However, knowing that Mary had a gunshot wound to the head, she just assumed that maybe the bullet had disrupted the eyeball, which can sometimes happen when someone has been shot in the head. And so she opened the other eye socket to look at the other eyeball. but that one was gone too. And soon she was able to determine that this wasn't a case of the bullet disrupting the eye socket. Mary's killer had actually removed her eyes and taken them away with them, probably to keep as some kind of sick trophy, as a reminder of what he had done. And they actually did a very good job at removing them too. When the eyelids were shut, there weren't any like scratches or scars, so it didn't look like it had been done by an amateur. That sounds really weird. What I mean is, it was very precisely done. It was like the person that did it knew what they were doing. Maybe they had some previous experience in these kind of surgical procedures. So the hunt was on to find Mary's killer, and one of the first things the police did in this investigation was go and speak to other sex workers in the area where Mary operated most evenings, just to see if maybe they could provide any information about her murder or who her killer might have been. And they did get a huge lead from one of these sex workers. In fact, this sex worker in particular claimed that she was actually there when Mary Pratt was killed, and she was almost killed herself, but she managed to escape. So this woman was named Veronica Rodriguez, and she said that she was working in Oak Cliff's red light district on the same night as Mary Pratt. In fact, they were actually working together. Veronica said that she and Mary were out in a field with this guy, and I think this guy had offered to pay both of the women for sex. So they went to this field with him, but when they got there, Veronica said that he started attacking them and she managed to escape and run away. But Mary wasn't so lucky. She fell to the floor and she was shot and killed by the man. Veronica told the police that after she escaped, she immediately ran to a nearby house, one of the neighbours' houses, and that neighbour was able to help her. Now, when the police spoke to Veronica about all of this, she did have some cuts and bruises on her. She had some mud in her hair, so it did look like something had happened to her. Although the officers did have their doubts when it came to Veronica's story, because I believe she was a drug addict and she was on drugs that night, the night that it happened. But also they had their doubts because Veronica was known to make up stories a lot, or just kind of exaggerate stories. So the police still interviewed and took a statement from her, but they were very cautious. They were aware of the fact that they might not be able to trust her account 100%. Although, to be honest, in her interview, she didn't really provide much more information than what I've already told you. She just said that she and Mary were working together when they were attacked by a man and she managed to flee the scene. She said that she couldn't really recall the name of the neighbour that helped her after she ran, nor could she remember what the attacker looked like. She couldn't give a detailed description of him. So the police were really struggling with this case. All they really had to go on was Veronica's statement, but with her not being able to describe Mary's killer, it was a pretty useless tip and Mary's case just started to go cold. But then suddenly, in February of 1991, about 2 months after Mary Pratt's murder, the Dallas police received a report that another body had been found. This second body was found just dumped on the same road about 8 blocks away from where Mary's body was discovered in the Oak Cliff area in Dallas. It was another young woman, and again it was clear just from looking at her that she had been murdered. In fact, her murder was very, very similar to that of Mary Pratt. She was partially nude when she was found. Her shirt had been pulled up to expose her breasts and her arms and legs were stretched out. So again, she had been positioned in a certain way by her killer. Her cause of death was also from gunshot wounds. However, she had been shot more times than Mary. Obviously, Mary had that one gunshot wound to her head, whereas this victim had been shot multiple times in the torso area and also in her head. But not only that, when she was taken for an autopsy, it was also found that she was missing both of her eyes. Her eyeballs had been expertly removed from from the sockets, just like with Mary. So the police just knew that these two cases had to be linked. Whoever killed Mary had to have been responsible for this murder too. This second victim was eventually identified through her fingerprints as being Susan Peterson. She was a 27-year-old woman who, like Mary, also worked as a sex worker in the red light district area. Susan was described as being very outgoing, very sociable, very friendly, but she was also just incredibly tough. She was able to defend herself, which only made her murder terrify the police and other sex workers even more. It was clear by this point that the person that was doing all of this, the killer, they were obviously targeting sex workers for some reason. And if they're able to overpower and kill a woman like Susan, who was known for being able to put up a fight, then they could do this to anyone. And at this point, the murders of Mary and Susan was huge news, and everyone in Dallas was just so frightened. The police were even warning the sex workers to stop going out at night because it was way too dangerous for them. A killer was on the loose, and both his victims were sex workers that had been out working the streets on the nights that they were killed. So they were told to just stay safe and don't go out, but it wasn't that easy for a lot of these women. They didn't really have a choice. A lot of these women had drug addictions that they funded through their sex work, but also I'm sure many of them had mouths to feed as well. They had families that they needed to support, so just not working was not an option for them. So because the Dallas police were really struggling to catch Mary and Susan's killer, they actually got in contact with the FBI and asked for them to help with the investigation. They basically asked the FBI if they could check their database, because they have a database where they store information and files about the majority of murder cases in the US. So they asked them to check their database to see if any other murders in the country bore similarities to the two murders in Oak Cliff in Dallas. In particular, they wanted to know if any other murder victims had had their eyes surgically removed by the killer, because if they had, then it's likely the same guy that was responsible. But unfortunately, there was nothing. They did not have a victim in the database that also had their eyes removed. So this was a very unique case. Following this setback, the police decided to try and come up with a psychological profile of their killer and try to figure out what their motive was for all of this. So they believed that because the two victims were killed using a gun, that meant that the murderer wanted them dead quickly. He didn't enjoy the actual killing part. Well, he probably did, but that wasn't his main motive. It wasn't killing someone that did it for him, because he made sure that that part was out of the way quickly by shooting them. It's believed that the murders were partly sexually motivated because of how the victims had been positioned after death with their genitals and their breasts exposed. But the main motive for these crimes was clearly the eyeballs. For some reason, the killer wanted those eyeballs. They obviously had some sort of fascination or obsession with eyes. And psychologists believed that that probably tied in with the sexual motive. The killer got some kind of sexual pleasure from removing his victims' eyeballs and keeping them as trophies. And because of the way in which the killer removed the eyes, like I said earlier, it was very well done. They hadn't made a mess of it. So because of that, the police theorized that the killer had some kind of medical experience. So perhaps he was a doctor or a surgeon. As well as that, the police believed that the killer was likely from the Oak Cliff area where the bodies were found, or he at least lived nearby, or he knew the area really well because he knew where he could dump the bodies in the middle of the night so that he wouldn't be seen. He was someone that probably visited the red light district area often. He would regularly sleep with sex workers, and if he had a partner, he likely had a job that meant he would often be out at night so that his partner wouldn't question why he would be out so late. As part of this inquiry, in an attempt to catch the murderer, the police had female police officers dress up and pretend that they were were sex workers, hoping that they might catch the killer in the act. They had undercover police officers that were taking photos of cars that would drive through the red light district area. The police continued taking statements from sex workers. They were doing everything they possibly could to solve this case. But still, weeks after Susan's murder, they had nothing. I don't even think they had one suspect. Or at least that was until about a month after Susan's death, when the police officers were just out, I think just driving around the area, and they came across Veronica Rodriguez, the woman that claimed to have witnessed Mary Pratt's murder. Now, from what I can gather about this situation, I won't lie, this part confused me a bit whilst I was researching. I'm not entirely sure what exactly happened, but from what I can understand, Veronica was out on the streets and she was about to sleep with a client. Obviously, she was a sex worker, and the police officers noticed that this was about to happen, and so they decided to, I think, either arrest or just speak to the guy that Veronica was about to sleep with, because of course they were looking for the killer, and the killer was targeting sex workers. So they were about to arrest him when Veronica ran up to the police and said, "No, don't arrest him. He's the guy that saved me." She claimed that this man was the neighbour that helped her that night after she ran away from Mary Pratt's killer. So now the police obviously wanted to speak with this man that helped Veronica, because maybe he would be able to provide some more information about that night. Maybe he saw the killer's face. The police soon found out that this guy's name was Axton Schindler, although his nickname was actually Speedy because apparently he talked really fast. So he was brought down to the station for an interview, although the police didn't really get much out of him. He was actually very evasive. He seemed nervous. He just wasn't really willing to cooperate with the police or answer their questions, which actually made them quite suspicious of him. They were thinking, okay, did he not want to cooperate with the police because maybe he was worried and embarrassed about the fact that he was caught with a sex worker? Or maybe the reason he didn't want to cooperate with the police was because he knew more about these murders, Mary Pratt's murder, than he was letting on. Perhaps he had something to do with it. But that wasn't the only reason why they had their suspicions about Axton Schindler. You see, when Mary's body was found in December of 1990, it was discovered dumped on a street in the south of Oak Cliff in Dallas. But when the police had a look at Axton Schindler's driving license, they realised that he actually lived in a house in the north area of Oak Cliff. His address was 1035 Eldorado Avenue, which is approximately 9 miles away from the south. And yet Veronica claimed that she ran to his house after she escaped the attacker, but Schindler was on the other side of town. So this whole story just seemed really off, and the police had their concerns about Axton Schindler, but they couldn't do anything. They couldn't charge him because they had no concrete evidence linking him to the murders. And so they had no choice but to let him go. But nevertheless, he was still a strong suspect in the investigation. They were going to keep a close eye on him. And not long after this, the killer in Dallas struck again. On the 10th of March 1991, about a month after Susan Peterson's body was discovered, the body of a third victim was found. Again, this victim was a woman. It was an African-American woman this time, and she was just dumped on the side of a road. In fact, I believe her body was found near an elementary school in Oak Cliff. She was completely naked on the ground, and this time the killer had actually mutilated the victim's face. Sources state that she had a broken nose, she had a lot of bruises and cuts on her face, so she had very clearly been beaten. Maybe there was a violent struggle before her death, and her cause of death was from gunshot wounds. She had been shot multiple times in her face and also the top of her head. And yes, you guessed it, the eyes had also been removed from the sockets. This third victim would eventually be identified as Shirley Williams. she was a 45-year-old married mother of one. She had one daughter. Just like the other two victims, Shirley worked as a sex worker, although that wasn't all that she did. She also had a day job at a hotel in Dallas where she worked as a housekeeper. And then in the evenings, she would do her sex work, I think, to just make some extra cash. So once again, a sex worker had been targeted. It seemed as though Shirley was probably working in the red light district area the night before her body was found, and that she was picked up at some point that evening by her killer and murdered. Now, because Shirley had sustained more injuries than the other two victims, obviously, as I said, she had been beaten before she had been shot, that indicated that she was able to put up some kind of a fight. So the police were hoping that because of that, even though this was the early 90s, they were hoping that they might be able to find some of the killer's DNA on her body. Maybe she had scratched the killer and their DNA was under her fingernails or something. Now, during the autopsy, the medical examiner noticed that Shirley had a cut, I believe on the right side of her face, just to the right of her eye. And when they conducted an x-ray of this area, they noticed that near this cut, I believe actually in the right eye socket, there was a small fragment of something metal. So they removed this tiny piece of metal. It was like a little triangle shape, and they were soon able to determine that it was an X-Acto knife blade. And so after discovering this blade, the police realised how the killer had been removing the eyeballs. It was using an X-Acto knife. They weren't a doctor or surgeon that was using like professional medical tools. They were just using a knife to cut out the eyes, although they still believed that the killer probably had some knowledge of the anatomy to be able to do it so well. They had studied eyes before. Also found on Shirley Williams' body were two head hairs. She was holding two head hairs in her left hand, and the police believed that these were probably the killer's hair, where she had grabbed their hair before she was shot. And on top of that, a pubic hair was also discovered on the back of Shirley's neck. Again, this was most likely the killer's. So this was a huge breakthrough for the police. They finally had what they believed to be the killer's DNA, something that they weren't able to find on the first two victims. And just a few days after this discovery, the police received even more evidence in this case, this time from a witness, another sex worker in Oak Cliff, who claimed to have been attacked by a client that may have been the Dallas killer that the police were looking for. This sex worker was named Brenda White, and one night Brenda was just out working in the red light district when she was picked up by a man that she was going to sleep with. He was going to pay her for sex. So she got into his vehicle and she told him to drive to a certain place where they were going to do the deed. However, she began really panicking when this man started driving in a different direction. So she said to him straight away, "I'm getting out of the car, let me out." But he refused to, and he got very, very angry, and he turned to Brenda and said, quote, "I hate hoes. I'm gonna kill all of you hoes." And so at that point, Brenda pulled out some mace that she had, I think, in her pocket or her bag, and she sprayed it at him whilst he was still driving, and she just jumped out of the car and she ran. Thankfully, Brenda escaped with her life, and not long after the attack, she went and spoke to the police about what had happened to her. She described her attacker to the police as being a white male who was, quote, Mexican looking, and apparently what she meant by that was that he had an olive skin tone. She said that he had a muscular build and also salt and peppered coloured hair, so like grey hair. So now the police had an accurate description of who they believed the killer was. Only problem was it didn't match up at all with the only suspect in the case, Axton Schindler. So the police began thinking that maybe Schindler wasn't the guy that they were looking for. Also, even though Veronica Rodriguez, the woman who claimed to have witnessed the first victim, Mary Pratt's murder, even though she was unable to give a detailed description of the killer, the one thing she did say about him was that she also thought he had salt and pepper coloured hair. And this, of course, matched matched what Brenda White had said. So it seemed as though Veronica was probably telling the truth about that night, and that maybe Axton Schindler wasn't the killer since he didn't match the description. Axton Schindler wasn't fully ruled out as a suspect just yet, but he wasn't like the top suspect anymore. He was more like a person of interest in the investigation now. So the police were still kind of looking into him, but they were looking at other people too. And after the information they received from Brenda White, the police officers that were kind of leading this investigation, officers Regina Smith and John Matthews, they went to the Dallas County Constable's office. They wanted to use the constable's computer system because that contained more information about local residents and citizens of Oak Cliff than the computer at their local police station did. And using the constable's computer, the officers just entered a load of addresses in Oak Cliff around the areas where the victims' bodies were found to see if any of the owners of these properties matched the description of the man that Brenda White described, since they strongly believed that the killer was someone that lived locally. And one of the addresses that they just randomly entered into the computer was 1035 Eldorado Avenue in the north of Oak Cliff, which, if you remember, was the address on Axton Schindler's driving license. That was where he lived. However, when the police put this address into the computer system, they were quite surprised because they discovered that the owner of this property wasn't actually Axton Schindler. It was another man named Frederick Albright. Frederick Albright was just Axton Schindler's landlord. But that property, 1035 Eldorado Avenue, wasn't the only one that Frederick Albright owned. He actually owned 3 different properties. One of them was the one that Schindler rented, which was near where Shirley Williams, the third victim's body, was dumped. And the other 2 properties were located very, very close to where the first 2 victims' bodies were found, Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson. So this Frederick Albright seemed to have a link to all 3 murders. So now they had another suspect in the case. Maybe Frederick Albright was the killer that they had been looking for. However, the police soon realised that this couldn't have been the case. He couldn't have been the murderer because Frederick Albright was dead, and he had died about 4 or 5 years before the murders were committed. But that was when another police officer that was in the office at the time said to Regina Smith and John Matthews, "Wait a minute, I recognise that last name Albright." He said that he had received a report from someone about a man with that same last name, Albright. He received this report several weeks before this. In fact, I believe it was not long after Mary Pratt's murder, so I'm not sure why the police didn't look into it earlier. Anyway, this report came from a woman who wished to remain anonymous, but she basically told the police officer that she briefly dated this guy who, according to some sources, she had actually met through Mary Pratt, the first victim. And she said that this guy was really nice at first, the relationship was going well, but it soon started to turn sour when he became violent and abusive, and he began expressing his weird fascination for eyeballs. And she even said that she knew that he owned a lot of X-Acto knives, the same knives that the police believe the killer used to cut out the victim's eyes. When asked what this man's name was, the woman said that he was called Charles Albright, and Charles was the son of Frederick Albright, the deceased man that owned the 3 properties close to where the bodies were dumped. Charles Albright was 57 years old, and when the police typed his name into the system, it was found that he did have a criminal record. He had multiple charges and he had been to prison before, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And he very much matched the description that Brenda White gave of the man that attacked her. He was quite a muscular man, I guess. He had a strong build, he had an olive skin tone, and he had salt and pepper hair. And he had a reason to be out at night. Apparently he was a part-time newspaper delivery man, and he did the night shifts, which I didn't even know was a thing. I didn't know people delivered newspapers at night. Anyway, that was his part-time job, and so yeah, he had a good excuse for being out at night when all of the sex workers were out working on the streets. So immediately when the officers found all of this out, when they had a look into Charles Albright, they were sure that he was the guy they were looking for. They just had such a strong feeling that he was the killer, and so he quickly became the #1 suspect in the investigation. But before they did anything, before they arrested or questioned him, the police officers went and spoke to Brenda White, and with them they took a picture of Charles Albright and also some pictures of a few other men that vaguely matched the description that Brenda gave. They wanted to see if she would pick out Charles as the man that attacked her, and what do you know? That's exactly what she did. Immediately, as soon as she saw Charles's picture, she said that she was certain that that was him. He was the one who attacked her. They also did the same with Veronica Rodriguez. They did a photo lineup and she also picked out Charles Albright. She said that he was the man that she escaped from. In fact, one source I read said that as soon as Veronica saw the picture of Charles, she literally started trembling because she was so scared of him. So now their 2 witnesses in the case had picked him out of a lineup, and after this the police were certain, now more than ever, that he was the Dallas serial killer. And now the police had enough evidence to arrest him, and so that is exactly what they set out to do on the 22nd of March 1991. It was the early hours of the morning, around like 2 a.m, when a team of armed police officers gathered around the home that Albright was staying in. They wanted to swarm the house at night because then hopefully Albright would be asleep and he would have no idea what was about to happen and no chance to run. So they gathered around the house, they all got into position, and then all at once they burst into the property and shouted for everyone in the house to get on the ground. The only people in the house at the time was Charles Albright and also his girlfriend, whose name was Dixie. Charles was immediately apprehended and arrested, and his girlfriend was brought outside, and she was very nervous. She had no clue why the police were there, and she was terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be. But anyway, Charles was taken to the police station and he was charged. I believe he was charged with the attempted murder of Veronica because they didn't have enough evidence yet to charge him with the 3 murders. He was placed in custody, and now the police could begin working on their case against him. One of the first things the police did was obviously take his DNA samples so that it could be tested against any evidence, and they also sat down and interrogated him. But Charles Albright chose to keep very quiet, and he denied absolutely everything. He denied committing the murders, and he also denied having ever even been with a sex worker. He claimed that he had never slept with a sex worker in his life. But yeah, he quickly got a lawyer and he just refused to say anything. So it was clear to the police that there was no way that they were going to get a confession out of him, which meant that they had to look for other evidence that proved he was the killer. As part of the hunt for evidence, the police obviously searched Albright's home to see if they could find anything that linked him to the murders. Of course, one of the main things being the victim's eyeballs. Charles's home was very messy. It looked like he was a bit of a hoarder, to be honest. There were books and clothes and just rubbish everywhere, so it was quite difficult to search. But during their searches, they did find a couple of alarming things. They found a lot of books about serial killers that Albright had been reading, which was very concerning because it appeared as though he had almost been studying serial killers. They also found like little sections from newspapers that he had kept about the murders in Dallas, the ones that the police now believe he committed. He had been keeping these newspapers because they spoke about his killings. It seemed as though they were like a keepsake to him, a trophy, something that he could go back to and read over and over again and be proud of. In addition to that, they also found a lot of photographs that Albright had taken himself of different women. Basically, he would go around public places like shops and just on the street, and he would take his camera with him, and without their knowledge, he would take pictures of pretty much every woman that he passed. However, he would zoom in on their eyes. He just wanted pictures of their eyes. Also in his home, the police found a fireplace which had a secret trap door or a secret cover, and inside this fireplace the police found many guns, about 7 or 8 guns, which he wasn't actually allowed to own because he was a convicted felon. However, none of these guns actually matched the bullets that were used to kill the 3 sex workers, so it seemed as though he had probably hidden that gun somewhere else, or he had gotten rid of it by this point. But as well as the guns, the police also discovered a collection that he had of X-Acto knives. He had a huge collection of them just all over his house, and like I've mentioned, the police believed that these were the blades that he had used to cut out the victim's eyeballs. But let's just pause the actual case here for a second, and I will tell you a little bit more about Charles Albright and his background. So Charles Albright was born on the 10th of August 1933 in Amarillo in Texas. However, as soon as he was born, he was actually placed in an orphanage. He was placed there by his biological parents. But he wasn't in the orphanage for long. When he was just 3 weeks old, he was adopted by a married couple named Frederick and Dal Albright. Fred worked as a grocer, whereas Dal worked as a full-time mum. She would stay at home and look after Charles all day, every day. And the Albright family lived in a very middle-class neighborhood in Oak Cliff in Dallas. So Charles had lived there in Oak Cliff pretty much all his life. He knew the area very well. And Charles's parents really doted on him, particularly his mother Dal. She adored her son. She really did everything she could for him. However, alongside this, Dal could also be very strict and controlling and critical of her son. She was very particular about every little thing that he did. He could only eat certain foods that she thought were good for him. So, for example, they had a pet goat in their back garden because Dal would not allow Charles to drink cow's milk. She didn't want him drinking cow's milk because she thought that it was bad for him. She would insist that he played piano for a certain amount of time every single day. She would force him to take naps at specific times, even tying him to the bed so that he couldn't move or get up before his nap time ended. She would occasionally force Charles to wear girls' dresses, and she would dress him up as if he were a doll. And if he ever did anything wrong, so for example, if he didn't finish his milk, or if he didn't play the piano, if he didn't want to be dressed up as a girl, he would be punished by his mother. Sometimes she would even get physical with him, so she would hit him as punishment. And other times she would do things like shutting him in a pitch black room for a few hours. And bear in mind, he was a very young child, a toddler even, when all of this started. And how terrifying must it have been for a toddler to be locked in a dark room? It was very odd and mixed because on the one hand, Dal could be a very caring and loving and supportive mother, but then she could also be incredibly strict and abusive. And growing up, Charles really started to resent that side of his mother, the side of her that was controlling. But one thing that Charles did really like about his mother and enjoyed doing with his mother was taxidermy. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically when people preserve animals' bodies once they have died by stuffing them. This was something that had always been a hobby of Dal's, and as Charles grew older, it became a hobby of his too, and they would pick up dead animals that they found in the neighborhood, and they would stuff them together. And Charles's favorite part of this whole process was removing the eyes, and they would replace the eyes with black sewing buttons because Dow couldn't afford the like fake marble eyes that you could buy from taxidermy shops. So she would buy black buttons and she would teach Charles how to sew them over the eye sockets. As Charles grew older, he was described as being a very intelligent child. He was one of the smartest students in his school, and this intelligence actually meant that he was able to skip a couple of grades. But he let himself down when he would behave badly, and he would get into trouble a lot with the teachers. This bad behavior started off very kind of minor, so like he would carry out a couple of pranks and he would misbehave in class, but then over time it started to get more serious, and he would do things like steal the answers for tests and make photocopies for him and his friends so that they could all cheat. And this eventually led to him committing crimes in his early teenage years. In fact, at age just 13, he was arrested for aggravated assault. I don't know exactly what happened. I don't know who he assaulted and why, but that just shows you how young he was when he started using violence. Following on from this, he started committing theft. On one occasion, he was arrested for breaking into a jewelry shop and stealing a watch. And according to some sources, he was also caught stealing some cash from another shop's cash register, and also 2 handguns and a rifle. And for all of these thefts, he was actually sentenced to spend a year in prison when he was just 16 years old. Following his release from prison at 17 years old, Charles started attending Arkansas State College, where he studied pre-med because he wanted to become a surgeon of all things. And he seemed to do very well in college. He was very focused on his studies. He did a lot of different courses, one of which being a human anatomy course, which he achieved an A grade in. He was a part of a French club, which he was the president of. He was on the student council. He helped edit the yearbook. He was on the football team. He was a model student. And people liked Charles Albright, really liked him. He was the kind of guy that was very charming and got along with everyone. And he was a funny guy too. Like I mentioned before, he was a jokester. He loved to pull pranks on people and have a laugh, which obviously that in itself is not a concerning thing to hear about in a serial killer's childhood. However, one prank in particular that he pulled is very alarming and disturbing. Basically, Charles Albright had a friend in college and his name was Andrew. And one day Andrew and his girlfriend split up. I think she broke up with him actually. And he was obviously very upset and angry about this. And so Andrew got all of the pictures that he had of his girlfriend and he just ripped them up and chucked them in the bin because he was so mad. However, later that day, Charles went into Andrew's dorm room. He took these torn up pictures out of the bin and he carefully cut out all of the eyes from the photos. Andrew's girlfriend's or ex-girlfriend's eyes, and he took these cutouts of her eyes and stuck them on the ceiling in Andrew's bathroom and also on the ceiling above Andrew's bed, so that when Andrew would get into bed and he would look up, he would just see these pictures of his ex-girlfriend's eyes just staring down at him, which is just so weird. I mean, aside from the fact that it's creepy as hell because of what Charles would later go on to do, murder women and then cut out their eyeballs, aside from that, it's just a really strange thing to do, and I wonder what Andrew's reaction to this was. But anyway, Charles was eventually expelled from Arkansas State College because even though he appeared to be a model student, he did not stop his stealing habit and he was caught stealing a couple of expensive items, I believe from an office in the school. So he was expelled, he was kicked out, and following this he went from job to job for a little while. He could never really hold down a job for very long, and he was still committing crimes and stealing alongside this. In the year 1984, when Charles was around 20 years old, he actually got married. He married his college girlfriend named Betty, and they eventually had a child together, a little girl. Now, despite getting expelled from college and not graduating, this didn't stop Charles from securing a job that required a degree, because you see, he actually faked having a degree. He faked having a master's and bachelor's degree by forging a load of documents and signatures, and unbelievably this worked, and he got a job as a biology teacher in a high school in East Dallas. And he was a very popular teacher. The other teachers liked him, the pupils liked him. However, he was ultimately fired from this job when they found out that his degrees were forged and that he had lied. So he was fired and charged with fraud, and his punishment for this, I believe, was just a year's probation, although a couple of sources did state that he wasn't charged with anything because the school chose not to press charges against him, as it would look bad on them for hiring someone that didn't have the qualifications. So I'm not sure what's accurate there. I'm not sure if he was charged with anything, but anyway, following on from this, Charles continued going from job to job. As I said before, he never really stayed in one job for long, and of course, as well as this, he was still heavily involved with crime. He would steal and commit robberies, he would shoplift. On one occasion he was arrested after he stole hundreds of dollars worth of merchandise from a hardware shop, and for this he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but in the end he was released early after having served just 6 months of a 2-year sentence. And that was the thing about Charles Albright. With every crime that he committed, he always seemed to almost get off lightly. He was arrested many times over the years for the thefts and the robberies, but his punishment would only ever be like probation, or he would be ordered to serve very short sentences in prison. And I guess that was because his crimes never really hurt anyone physically anyway. Apart from that aggravated assault when he was 13, he was never arrested for any violent crimes, or at least that was until the year 1981. At this point in 1981, Charles would have been around 48 years old, and he was an active member of a Catholic church in Dallas. And through this church, he became good friends with one particular family who were obviously also Catholic. He was such good friends with them, in fact, that he would often visit their home and stay with them, and he would, I think, babysit for them. They had a young daughter, and he would play with her and take her out to the playground. However, the parents of this young girl soon discovered that their friend, Charles Albright, was molesting her, sexually molesting their daughter, who was just 9 years old. Now, the parents did report Charles to the police, and he was charged, and the case was due to go to trial because Charles was denying everything. But the parents of this 9-year-old girl did not want her to have to go through the trial and have to give evidence against Charles and talk about what happened to her. And so because of this, the prosecution offered Charles a deal, and they said, if you plead guilty to this, your sentence will not be as bad. You will get a lighter sentence. And so that's exactly what he did. He pleaded guilty, and once again, he was just given probation. He got put on probation for molesting a 9-year-old girl. A couple of years after this, in 1985, he began dating a woman named Dixie. He had divorced his wife, Betty, years earlier, and in 1986, he moved in with his new partner, Dixie. And by this point, both of his parents had passed away. I believe his mother, Dal, passed away in 1981, and his father, Frederick, died in 1986. And when he did, Charles inherited quite a lot of money from his father. Some sources state that he inherited around $100,000. And I think he also inherited the 3 properties that his father owned, the ones that were located very close to where each of the 3 victims' bodies would be found a couple of years later. And that brings us back to where we were before in the case. So as we know, 3 sex workers had all been shot and killed within just 3 months, between December of 1990 and March of 1991. The victims were 33-year-old Mary Pratt, 27-year-old Susan Peterson, and 45-year-old Shirley Williams. And after Shirley's murder, the police identified Charles Albright as the main suspect when they realised that a lot of the evidence they had in this case implicated him as the killer. He had links to all 3 crime scenes. He had connections to the first victim, Mary Pratt. He was a newspaper delivery man at the time, and he did the night shift, so he had a reason to be out at night when the sex workers were out on the streets. He matched the description that Brenda gave, and he was picked out of a lineup by the 2 witnesses, Veronica and Brenda. And when the police searched his home, they discovered that he had a lot of guns, which he wasn't allowed to own because of his previous criminal convictions. And as well as that, he also had a huge collection of X-Acto knives. So the police were very, very confident that they had their killer. But the only problem was, even though the police had quite a lot of evidence, it was all circumstantial, really. They didn't have anything concrete linking him to the murders, and if the case was going to go to trial, they needed solid proof to convict him. After searching his property, the police soon discovered that Charles Albright rented a storage unit not too far from his home, and so thinking that there might be some evidence inside there, the police went to go and search it, and they found some pretty creepy things in there. The detectives described it as looking like something out of a horror movie. In his storage unit, they found loads of creatures and dead animals preserved in jars of formaldehyde, and these jars were all stacked on shelves in the unit. And these animals included newts, frogs, lizards, snakes. There were a lot of his taxidermy creations in there, a lot of stuffed animals, and the police were hopeful that this might be the place where he kept the victims' eyeballs. Maybe he was hiding them in some of these jars, and at one point the police actually thought that they had found some of the eyeballs, but it turns out that it was just pig's eyes that they found. No human eyeballs were discovered in the storage unit. And unfortunately, once again, the police didn't find any concrete evidence in the unit connecting him to the murders. And so the hunt for evidence continued, and one of the things the officers did in an attempt to hopefully gather some more witnesses was they went back out onto the streets with a picture of Charles Albright, and they asked the local sex workers if they recognised him, and pretty much every single one did. They all said, yep, they knew him. He was a regular client of many sex workers in the red light district, which was very interesting to learn, considering Charles claimed that he had never in his life used a sex worker. The sex workers that had come across Charles Albright before said that there were almost 2 sides to him. Sometimes he would be really, really nice and kind to the sex workers. He would buy them food and he would give them clothes when it was cold in the evenings. But then when it actually came to getting down to business and having sex, they said that his whole demeanour would just completely change. He would suddenly turn into this sadistic and very aggressive man, and he would actually pay them extra money if they allowed him to do things like hit them and beat them with a rope during sex, and he would tell them to scream and act like they were scared because that's what he enjoyed. But still, this information from the sex workers was circumstantial evidence at best. They still did not have any solid proof to say that Albright was the murderer. But then the police spoke to this one particular sex worker that would prove to provide the breakthrough the police needed in the case, or she would lead them to the breakthrough in the case. This sex worker's name was Tina, and she was actually best friends with Shirley Williams, the 3rd victim who was killed in March of 1991. And Tina told the police that the last time she ever saw Shirley was that night, the night that she was murdered. She said that they were both out on the streets working that evening, and Tina actually remembered seeing Charles Albright on the streets that night. He was driving around, clearly looking for a sex worker to pick up. And Tina says that as soon as she saw Charles Albright, she left because she didn't want anything to do with him. She knew how violent he could be and she didn't want to get hurt. So she went straight away, but Shirley stayed, and Shirley was pretty much the only other sex worker working that night. And when Tina returned later on, she noticed that Shirley was now gone, and then just the next day, she was found dead on the side of a road. Tina told the officers that when she last saw Shirley that night, she was wearing a yellow raincoat, but the raincoat wasn't with Shirley when her body was found. As we know, she was completely naked when her body was discovered. And she also told the officers about a specific field that Shirley used to take her clients to, Charles Albright being one of them. I believe he was one of Shirley's regulars, so Tina believed that if she was picked up by Albright that night, that might have been where she was taken and killed, in that field. So the police went to this field again to look for evidence, and there they found a yellow raincoat that was covered in blood. This was Shirley Williams' raincoat. Now, when this raincoat was collected as evidence and sent off for testing, scientists found a couple of hairs on it, and some of these hairs appear to have come from some kind of animal. They weren't human hairs, and it took a while for the scientists to identify exactly which animal they'd come from, but they eventually determined that these were hairs from a squirrel's tail. And you might be thinking, well, how does squirrel hair on Shirley's coat link to Charles Albright? Well, when the police searched his home, they took his vacuum cleaner bag, and inside this bag they also found a lot of hairs, some of which matched the squirrel hairs that were found on Shirley's coat. So what they think happened is that the squirrel hairs somehow got on Shirley's body and on her coat in the field. She was murdered in the field, and then Albright put her body in his car and he drove it and dumped it on the roadside where it was found the next day. So when he put her body in his car, some of the squirrel hairs must have dropped off of her, and then not long after the murder he clearly cleaned and vacuumed his car, and that's how the hairs ended up in his vacuum cleaner bag. And in addition to this, they also found 8 human head hairs in his vacuum cleaner bag that, when tested, were found to have the same characteristics as Shirley Williams' hair. Her hair was in his vacuum cleaner. And if you remember from earlier on in the video, when Shirley's body was found, the medical examiner discovered 2 head hairs in her hand where she had probably tried to fight off her attacker and grabbed his hair. And a pubic hair was also found on the back of her neck. And when these were all tested, it was discovered that they were a match to Charles Albright. So now there was quite a substantial amount of evidence linking him to Shirley's murder, but the police were still really lacking in evidence that connected him to the first 2 victims. But despite that, despite the lack of evidence, he was still charged with all 3 because the cases were just so similar. They had to have been committed by the same person, Charles Albright. So he was charged with all 3, but Albright maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty, which meant that the case had to go to trial. However, unfortunately, during the trial, the cases against Albright for the first 2 murders of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, they basically just collapsed because the prosecution just did not have enough evidence against Charles to concretely say that he was responsible for their deaths. And according to one source I read, they had a bit of trouble with Veronica Rodriguez during the trial. Remember, she was the woman who claimed to have been there when Mary Pratt was killed. And as we talked about earlier, Veronica was known to be quite an unreliable person, and she wasn't the most trustworthy. And apparently when it came to the trial, she actually decided to testify as a witness for the defense team. for Charles's side. She basically claimed that she had been coerced by the police into saying that she had been there that night, the night that Mary was killed, and she had been coerced into picking out Charles's picture in the photo lineup. Honestly, this part of the case really confused me. I think the whole trial was just a bit of a shambles, and so in the end, the jury only found Charles Albright guilty of one murder. He was found guilty of the murder of the third victim, Shirley Williams, because hers was really the only case out of the three that the prosecution had solid evidence against him for. In December of 1991, Charles Albright was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Shirley, meaning that he was never going to be released. And that is pretty much it for this case. Sadly, Albright was never convicted of the first two murders of Mary and Susan, even though the majority of people believe that he killed them too. But he never went to trial for those because the evidence just wasn't there, and without evidence he couldn't be prosecuted. Some people do speculate whether Charles was actually guilty of all three, or if maybe Shirley was in fact his only victim. They theorized that maybe Charles was kind of like a copycat killer of the original eyeball murderer. Maybe the person that killed Susan and Mary has just never been caught to this day. Some people do suspect that Axton Schindler was the one that killed those two, although he has been officially ruled out now by the police. He is not believed to have been the killer. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think that Charles was responsible for all three of them? Do you think he was a serial killer? I personally do believe that he was responsible for all three. I just think the cases were way too similar, and with Charles's obsession with eyeballs, I just think he had to be their killer. It's just such a shame that he was never convicted of those two. Mary and Susan never received justice for their murders, and they most likely never will, because Charles Albright is now dead. He passed away just last year in September of 2020 whilst he was still in prison. I'm not sure exactly how he died, but he was 87 at the time, so maybe it was just natural causes from old age, as there isn't any information online that states otherwise. But yeah, that is it for this case. Such a wild one. I really hope this all made sense. Honestly, this one was so difficult to research. There were a lot of conflicting sources that stated different things, so it was a struggle to piece this whole case together, but as always, I hope that I did the case justice. Before I go, I would just like to say a huge thank you once again to Audible for kindly sponsoring this video. Remember, you can visit audible.com/Molly, or you can text Molly to 500 500 to start your free 30-day trial. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys!